Our scripture this morning comes from Genesis chapter 37, verses 1 through 4 and 12 through 28. And I invite you to follow along as I read from the Bible. You can find it in the church pews on page 30. The print's a little small, so bear with me. Joseph settled in the land where his father had lived as an alien, the land of Canaan. This is the story of the family of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was shepherding the flock with his brothers. He was a helper to the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of the other of his children because he was the son of his old age, and he had made him a long robe with sleeves. But when his brothers saw that the father loved him more than his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them. And he answered, Here I am. So he said to him, Go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring word back to me. So he sent him from the valley of Hebron. He came to Shechem, and a man found him wandering in the fields, and the man asked him, What are you seeking? I'm seeking my brothers, he said. Tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock. And the man said, They have gone away, for I heard them say, Let us go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him from a distance, and before he came near them, they conspired to kill him. They said to one another, Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we shall say that a wild animal has devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams. But when Reuben heard it, he delivered him out of their hands, saying, Let us not take his life. Reuben said to them, Shed no blood, throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but lay no hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hands and restore him to his father. So then Joseph came up to his brothers, and they stripped him of his robe, the long robe with sleeves that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit. Now the pit was empty, there was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat, and looking up they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, with their camels carrying gum, balm, and resin, on their way to carry it down to Egypt. When Judah said to his brothers, What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. And his brothers agreed. When some Midianite traders passed by, they drew Joseph up, lifting him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt.
I want to do something real quick. You're going to laugh at me when I say this, but Nancy, could we sing a song? Do you know why I want to sing a song? Because I have the wrong sermon up here. I shall return. So what shall we sing? Let's sing a chorus of a song, shall we? Believe it or not, I've done that before, but have been able to wing it. This is just not one of those weeks, so I'm not going to be able to do it. I ever tell you, I don't know, Katie may have told this story before, but the first Sunday that she served as associate minister, I came down here and first page of my sermon wasn't there, and I thought, so I winged it, and I went on up, and I said to Katie afterwards, I says, oh my gosh, you're not going to believe this, but I forgot to print the first page of my sermon, and so I just winged that, and she just turns pale. And I'm thinking, what's wrong, Katie? And she picks up this stack of papers that she had put on the music stand here, and she found it, and she said, please don't fire me. It's all good, Katie, it's all good. A few weeks ago, I had... somebody said something in regards to a remark that I made in my sermon. They said, you talk a lot about how you love the stories of the Old Testament, but you hardly ever preach from the Old Testament. And I'm like, yeah, guilty as charged. We're going to change that. We're going to change that week. So the passage on the table this morning that Barbara read is part of a story about how the nation of Israel came about. And we have three of the world's major monotheistic religions that trace their origins to this story. They call them Abrahamic traditions because it comes from the family of Abraham. Anybody be able to tell me what those three religions are? Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. Yeah. So we've got three of the world religions who we call Abrahamic faith traditions. They call them Abrahamic faith traditions because Abraham and his descendants was where the ball started rolling for all of these three religions. This is their origin story. Islam claims to be descendants of Abraham's son Ishmael, and she had already talked about the Ishmaelites. Judaism and Christianity claim to be the descendants of Abraham's son, Jacob. And Jacob's name was actually eventually changed to Israel. So you can see why this story is important. And so Jacob had 12 sons: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. I didn't even have to look at this to do that. So these sons represent the 12 tribes that eventually became the nation of Israel. What Barbara read was a little snippet of what it was like growing up in the house of Jacob or in the house of Israel. And it does not read like an episode of the Brady Bunch now, does it? It's kind of more like a jacked up version of Days of Our Lives. So if you were to look at this story of Israel as a TV episode, this would be the episode where the attention starts to focus on Joseph. Papa Jacob, Papa Israel, had this thing about playing favorites. Joseph's mother, Rachel, was the favorite of Jacob's two wives. Joseph's mother, Rachel, struggled with infertility for many, many years, which created some tension between her and Jacob's other wife, Leah, who also happened to be Rachel's sister. See, this is getting weird already, right? But that's just because we don't fully understand this culture. So it wasn't too terribly weird, but this is where it gets kind of buggy here. Rachel was insecure about her status as favorite wife, first wife, because she couldn't bear Jacob a son. But Leah, she didn't have any problem in the fertility department. So Rachel forced her handmaiden, Bilhah, to marry Jacob and become her surrogate. But then Leah retaliated and forced her handmaiden, Zilpah, to become her surrogate. It's almost like something out of the Jerry Springer show, isn't it, right now? And there's scraps of paper in the pews there if you need to draw this out to see who's related to whom. But it's important to know this backstory because the rivalries that we see between the sons in our text today make a whole lot more sense when you consider the level of dysfunction that is already present in this family. So, why is Joseph the favorite son? He's not the oldest, that's Reuben. He's not the youngest, that's Benjamin. So scholars wager that it's because Joseph was the first child that Rachel was able to give Jacob, and that it's possible that he looked most like her. And so Joseph's favored status then did not go over very well with his brothers. So, let's just set aside for the moment the fact that Joseph could be an annoying, weaselly little tattletale for a moment, okay? Let's just set that aside. People wanted to say that this is why his brothers hated him so much, but I think it had to do less with who he was and more to do with what he represented. Hooray for Joseph, the long-awaited son of Jacob, born of his favorite wife, Rachel. Isn't he just a little bundle of blessings? And then to add insult to injury, Joseph started getting preferential treatment. He got away with saying bad things about his brothers. And as if this weren't bad enough, Jacob gave Joseph a special robe with sleeves for him to wear. Other versions talk about a coat of many colors, which was just a daily visible reminder to his brothers about how this kid was so special. And it's no wonder that Joseph had dreams about being worshipped, right? He practically was. And eventually the other brothers just had enough of him. They had it. They tried to get away from him. They tried to just, you know how sometimes siblings do that? They're like, let's go hide from whoever. They tried to do this, but it didn't work out because pretty soon little Joe would catch up and find them and tell them all about the dreams he was having and about how everybody was bowing down and worshiping him and how they should do that too. And by this time, the brothers wanted Joseph dead. So they came up with this plan to beat him to death and toss his lifeless corpse into a pit for the animals to eat. But then Reuben, the oldest son, stepped in, and he got his brothers to back off. And he says, let's just beat him up and throw him in a pit. We shouldn't kill him ourselves. And honestly, I don't think Reuben was being particularly merciful here. I think maybe he was being opportunistic because this was his chance to gain favor with his father. He figured that maybe later on he'd go fetch Joseph out of the pit, bring him back home to Papa Jacob, and then be the hero. And then maybe he'd be the favorite son of Jacob, as it should be for the firstborn to be the favorite son. But then the other brothers, they started thinking opportunistically too. And they're like, hey, maybe instead of just letting him die, we can figure out a way of getting something out of this. Oh my gosh, you know what would be great? You know what we can do? You guys are going to love this. We can sell him to slavery. Now think about this. Who were the people of Israel? They were descendants of slaves, right? Their whole identity is tied up into God delivering them out of slavery in Egypt, so that they could be a great nation. So what do? They sell Joseph back into slavery. Now, could you imagine Simeon saying, oh my, no, you know what? You know what would be just perfect? If we sell this kid to slavers and he winds up back in Egypt. And guess what? That is exactly what happened. And so there you have it, this sordid little story about a ridiculously dysfunctional family with all the themes of jealousy, pride, vengeance, arrogance, the desire to be loved and admired and seen. Why is this story in the Bible? Right? Aren't these supposed to be the heroes of the faith, the ones that we're supposed to be emulating and trying to be more like? Aren't these the people that God handpicked to be the examples to the world? How can any of this be good? So, before we get all judgy, let's consider for a moment what we turn to for entertainment, okay? With the exception of some classic family-friendly shows like Leave It to Beaver and The Andy Griffith Show, what have been some of our most popular TV shows in recent history? The Sopranos, a show about a dysfunctional mob family. Sons of Anarchy, a show about a dysfunctional biker family. Shameless, a show about a family whose dysfunctions are too numerous to even name. Why do we watch these shows? Maybe it's because at some level we can all see these dysfunctional characteristics in our own lives. From a modern day perspective, there doesn't seem to be anything in this biblical story worth emulating, right? The problem is, even though these stories seem like shining examples of what not to do, they are familiar because sometimes we can place ourselves in them. Maybe you don't come from a family who's so dysfunctional that the siblings would gang up on the favorite kid to sell into slavery, but you might come from a family where the thought crossed somebody's mind, right? Yeah, be honest. There's a level of dysfunction in every family system. Part of being in the ministry involves helping people deal with the consequences and the outcome of both personal and family dysfunction. Now, which area of ministry do you think I encounter dysfunction the most? Oh, it's got to be our outreach ministry and service. Seeing people struggle with homelessness and addiction and poverty and injustice and things like that. And yeah, I see a good deal of it there. But no. Okay, well, it's got to be counseling then, right? Well, yeah, I encounter dysfunction there for sure, but by the time I'm doing counseling, people have at least recognized their dysfunction and want to do something about it. No, you know where I see the most raw, audible, visible, unedited, I wish I had a security guard on staff level dysfunction? Daggone weddings and funerals. Kid you not. Funerals especially. And I'm not very good at dealing with that stuff either. I'm a Bible nerd who likes to tell people about Jesus. But thankfully, I have a wife who did a couple of rotations in ER and trauma centers as a chaplain. She's good. They have her on speed dial over at Newton Bracewell for when families who get kicked off Geraldo walk in the door ready to fight, okay? Grief stirs things up. What I'm saying is that we have all experienced or have at least borne witness to some gut-wrenching, family-destroying dysfunction. This riot over the weekend in Charlottesville, Virginia, the one that has thus far left 3 people dead and 19 people injured. One of my favorite authors, Diana Butler Bass, lost a brother because of that incident. And no, he wasn't one of the people that was killed there. In fact, he wasn't even in Charlottesville at the time. No, he was a vocal supporter and defender of the torch-wielding white nationalist crowd that marched into town chanting old Nazi slogans, a crowd that included neo-Nazi groups and the Ku Klux Klan. And Diana, an ordained Episcopal minister, said, "You cannot call yourself a Christian and stand in solidarity with groups who oppose everything that Jesus stood for and taught." And her brother disowned her. No, there was no selling anyone into slavery. There was no violence. Back in June, during my Shocking Requirements to Follow Jesus series, I talked about how the values of Jesus would divide some families. This is an example of that. A sister spoke the gospel truth and lost a brother. So again, what can we take away from these stories that we read in the Old Testament, especially when we run into shocking displays of dysfunction like the ones in our scripture this morning? In the case of this story, Joseph's brothers probably thought they were delivering some divine justice by selling this rotten kid back to Egypt. They probably had a good laugh over the irony of this. Now see, I think we're able to get the most out of this story when we can place ourselves in them and then recognize our own similar feelings of jealousy and pride and our desire for vengeance. Sometimes it requires some painful self-reflection, but nobody, Jesus included, promised that maturity and growth would be painless, right? And that's the beauty of these stories that we read in the Bible. They stir up feelings. They cause us to stop and to ponder and to reflect. And as extreme as the dysfunctional dynamics are in this story that Barbara read, there is a point when we need to recognize that this is our story too. We are all members of a dysfunctional human family that desperately needs redemption. The good news is that we can learn something from this story if we're willing to be honest and see ourselves in it. So next week, we're going to see how the story unfolds when Joseph gets to reunite with his brothers after his mishaps and adventures in Egypt. Will the brothers finish the job? Will Joseph get revenge? And where does God fit into all of this? So tune in next week, same time, same channel, right here at First Christian Church, 10 o'clock.